Hello and welcome to NewsClick. This program is Real News. Today we have with us Rajat Nag, former MDG of Asian Development Bank, and we'll discuss the G20 summit. Rajat, we had discussed the G20 summit earlier, but today we really would like to focus on what do you think came out of it?
The communique out of Hangzhou was about 7,000 words long. Right at the end, there's something very interesting and very honest. It says, once we agree, we will deliver. Now, that I think is the fundamental problem. Not once we agree, because they agreed on everything which was in the 7,000 words communique, but once we agree on the priorities. So exactly the point you're making, Prabir, they did talk about all of these things, but it's sort of all over the place. They talked about international financial architecture. They talked about microbial, challenges, a health issue, food security. They talked about climate change. But at the end of it, as you said, so what will come out of it? And that is where I have my biggest problem, as I was mentioning the other day about the G20. In one sense, I think it's a very useful forum. 85% of the global GDP, 2/3 of the world population are around that table. So it's a great opportunity, and we saw it working very well in the aftermath of the global financial crisis. The London summit of 2009, I think, stands out as a very concerted effort by the leadership on an issue which was critical. Now it has become sort of a bit of everything, and therefore I think the institution really needs to prioritize. Otherwise, it will become, probably has become, a bit of a talk shop.
Coming to the three issues, we had discussed these three issues in our earlier discussions. One is what are called the tax havens. They have bounced the ball again to the OECD court. Now, OECD countries, the major countries, are the ones involved with the tax havens. Now, what is the point of bringing this back to the OECD table, who have a vested interest in not solving the problem?
And that's exactly the challenge. I mean, I might disagree with some of the characterizations that you made, but that's not the point. Point is, the G20 as a group have now set up what they're calling a task force on BESP, basic erosion and profit shifting. And it all came out when they realized that Google was not paying any taxes, and as a matter of fact, Starbucks wasn't paying, etc. So what they're doing really is just shifting the buck, passing the buck. And therefore, in this communique, as you would have seen, the G20 leaders note BESP and compliment the first meeting that has happened in Kyoto, and look forward to the G20/OECD group to think more about it. Nothing is going to happen for the reasons that you have mentioned. So let's take tax havens, for example. If the G20 feels that this is critical for the transparency in the financial architecture, and they do agree it is, then they have to say, okay, this is something we'll take on for the next 3 years, and we'll have something happen. Otherwise, it's just sort of repeating. Let me give you another example, not on the tax haven, but one I think which really typifies the problem. In Brisbane in 2014, when the world growth was fragile, it still is, but it was more fragile then, the G20 leaders said, we will, the G20, grow an additional 2% by 2018. Great, everybody applauded. 2015 in Turkey, they reiterated that. 2016, there's no mention of this 2%. There's mention of Brisbane, but no mention of 2016. And the reason is they didn't define what was the base. So additional 2% over what? And it would have grown at a certain level anyways. So these are the sort of things that I think G20 is getting itself really caught in the mire. Tax haven is one. Growth. They talk about coordination of growth.
You know, Rajat, when you talk about the steel glut, I'm thinking, well, if it is China, then of course a whole bunch of people do say they are affected. But the whole bunch of other things, for instance, people are affected, which again is to do with global trade, for example, and the fact that intellectual property is a huge issue. Now, Obviously, the US will never let it come
Exactly.
to G20 either.
Right.
So the question is, you cannot bring one issue to G20 which affects others and not put
Not
others
the
on the
other.
table. In which case, again, the issue would be that global trade, something has to be done, the architecture of WTO has to be examined. Then G20 can take an initiative, but it has to be a holistic one. It cannot be steel alone, say.
Exactly. But even more importantly, why talk about that global trade issue when you've got an institution called WTO? But what G20 could do, and this is where I think one has to think of some solutions. Let's take migration, which is, I think, a very major issue, the displacement of people that is happening because of various crises around the world. G20, what does it do? It recognizes global migration issues, particularly from the Middle East into Europe, as an issue, and then says, we will look into this. We have asked a task force again to look into this and tell us, the global leaders, what to do, and we'll talk about it in 2017. Now that, I think, is a total abdication of responsibility. Either you say migration is a major issue and there is no other institution which sort of looks at it, or don't waste time, just as you're saying, for trade. I mean, I agree with you. I mean, trade, steel is a major issue, oversupply in China, but so are the others. But why spend time
If
at
you're
the
not going to
summit?
solve it.
Solve it.
Now, let's get back to the issue of, for instance, of what you raised earlier in the earlier discussion that we had, inequality. Doesn't figure in anywhere. And the global inequality is a consequence of global trade is not mentioned. Now, we had also discussed that while global trade has increased, it has benefited a certain section, it has also disadvantaged seriously other sections, and the growth has not been quote unquote equitable. Now, this doesn't figure in. What says we'll promote trade, we'll fight populism, which means a Brexit kind of, I guess, backlash that we are seeing in different parts of the world. But really, again, no attempt to address inequalities as a consequence of global trade either.
What I think a forum like G20 can do, where I think there is general consensus of certain basic principles, i.e., global trade is good, you should remove barriers, you should have more sort of in economic activities which are cross-border. Those are sort of motherhood statements. What I think needs to be recognized is that globalization, particularly global trade, the benefits are diffused, the costs are local. So the steel manufacturer or the factory worker who loses his job because of globalization is a loser. The benefits of cheaper steel, cheaper goods, cheaper trade is diffused over a larger period. G20 should then say, now, what can we do for those who are affected negatively? Otherwise, the global benefits will always outweigh the costs and we're back to square one. Now, my feeling is that G20 needs to recognize that Brexit, or the appeal of Mr. Trump, strange as it might be, but there is a certain appeal of Mr. Trump as the polls continue to show, how is the global community going to counter this feeling, either of resentment or disappointment or disillusionment, whatever, about globalization?
It's an interesting point that you raise, that a lot of the things which seem to be quote unquote more important are really the geostrategic balances that get exhibited in terms of who stares at whom, who smiles at whom. In fact, both these have made the headlines recently. Putin and Obama staring at each other. It's called the death stare, apparently. And the fact that Erdogan was talking very nicely with Putin, again seen as a geostrategic shift. But leaving that out, do you think there is a need for a G20 secretariat to do this preparation, A? And do you think that the leadership in that sense of the country each time shifting itself is a problem, that there is really no permanent leader of G20?
You know, that's a very good point you've raised, Prabir, and it's a dilemma. On the one hand, you don't want to create one more international institution. And this is why when G20 was formed in 2008, it was recognizing on the one hand that G7, G8 was totally irrelevant and anachronism. and you needed to expand, but also that group of 77 or the UN was too big. So G20 seemed to be a reasonable forum, 85%, as I said, of the global GDP, 2/3 of the world population. But the downside is because it's a shifting chair, and every chair wants to leave its mark. And it's very interesting you raised that, because I was going through some of the communiques of the past few years. Nobody talks about saying, okay, look, no more new plan of action. Let us review what we said and have we done. So no sort of report card of the past, because there's not much glory in that. Therefore, Hangzhou consensus, Brisbane summit declaration of this 2% additional lift, etc. My feeling is that time has come when the G20 leaders need to think of it. Maybe a small secretariat, but the trouble is secretariats never remain small. But at the moment, the shifting chair may rotate, because in a global setting you have to do it, but probably a more permanent secretariat would be desirable.
Thank you very much, Rajat, for coming and talking to us on these issues.
Thank you.
This is all the time we have. Keep watching NewsClick for further episodes.